A billionaire with trembling hands sits alone on Christmas Eve, staring at his last drink, until a 7-year-old asks him why he looks so sad. The snow fell like ash against the towering glass walls of the Meridian Hotel, each flake dissolving the moment it touched the heated surface. Christmas Eve had turned the city into a postcard, lights twinkling, streets humming with last-minute shoppers, the kind of joy that felt almost aggressive in its abundance. But 69 stories above it all, in a restaurant designed for people who didn't need to look at price tags, Viggo Arden sat completely alone, not figuratively alone. Actually alone. Welcome to Stories by Jason. If you're settled in and ready for a good story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've got another exciting story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for the love and support. You're truly appreciated, and I'm so grateful to have you here with me. Also, let me tell you something funny. Someone actually bet that I can't reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this year, and honestly, I want to prove them wrong. So if you're watching this right now and you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and join the family. Reaching 1,000 subscribers is a very personal goal for me, and your support would mean the world to me. Thank you for believing in me and being part of this journey. And before you go, drop your name and location in the comments. I'd love to give you a special shout-out in my next video introduction. The Meridian's flagship restaurant, Lunar, was nearly empty. A skeletal staff moved through the space like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by plush carpeting that probably cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. Somewhere in the back, holiday music played at a volume so low it might as well have been a memory. Silent Night. How fitting. Viggo's table was positioned near the western window wall, offering an unobstructed view of the city he'd helped shape. His city. Buildings with his money in their foundations. Developments that bore his investments like invisible signatures. From up here, it all looked clean. Orderly. Beautiful even. From up here, you couldn't see the people. His hands trembled as he reached for his glass. Scotch, 30 years old, untouched, and he pulled back before his fingers could betray him further. The tremor wasn't new. It had started months ago, maybe longer. His doctor called it essential tremor, a benign condition common in older adults, nothing to worry about. But Viggo knew better. His hands shook because his body had finally stopped pretending everything was fine. He looked powerful, he supposed. His coat was Italian cashmere, charcoal gray, tailored to hide the weight he'd lost. His watch was platinum, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd actually checked it for the time rather than just feeling its weight on his wrist, evidence that he was still substantial, still here. But his eyes told a different story. Tired didn't begin to cover it. Hollowed out. Haunted. Viggo Arden had once been described by Financial Times as the investor with the Midas touch. Everything he backed turned to gold. Tech startups that became household names. Real estate ventures that reshaped urban landscapes. Pharmaceutical companies that doubled their stock value within 18 months of his involvement. He'd been brilliant once. Visionary. The kind of man whose phone calls got returned within the hour, whose presence at a charity gala guaranteed 6-figure donations before dessert was served. That was before. Before Margot died. Before he realized his son was already gone, years before his wife followed. Before the silence in his 12-bedroom mansion became so loud he couldn't stand to be there anymore. The restaurant was supposed to be different. Neutral territory. A place where memories didn't live in every corner, where he wouldn't walk past the chair Margot used to read in, or the piano his son Elias had played exactly twice before declaring it a waste of space. Viggo had chosen Lunar specifically because it was soulless, expensive, exclusive, and utterly devoid of sentiment. He'd been coming here every evening for 3 weeks. The staff knew better than to approach unless summoned. They'd learned quickly that Mr. Arden didn't want conversation, didn't want recommendations, didn't want anything except to be left alone with his overpriced scotch and the city lights that made everything look smaller than it actually was. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like an ending. Viggo's hand drifted to his coat pocket, fingers brushing against the small amber bottle he'd been carrying for 2 months. He hadn't planned it, exactly. Or maybe he had, and he just hadn't admitted it to himself. The pills were prescribed, legally, properly, by a doctor who thought he was treating insomnia. And they would work. He'd researched it. Quietly. Carefully. The kind of research he used to do before making investments, except this time the asset being liquidated was himself. He didn't want to hurt. He was so tired of hurting. The door to the restaurant opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the muffled sound of elevator music from the hallway. Vigo didn't turn. Another couple seeking a quiet Christmas Eve dinner, probably. More proof that normal people still knew how to function, how to sit across from someone and pretend the world made sense. But it wasn't a couple. A woman entered first, her movements careful, almost apologetic. She was younger than Vigo, mid-30s, maybe, with dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail and a coat that had seen better winters. She wasn't dressed for lunar. She wasn't dressed for the meridian at all. Her boots left small puddles of melted snow on the marble floor. Behind her, holding her hand, was a little girl. 7 years old, maybe 8. She wore a red coat with a hood lined in fake fur, the kind of thing you'd find at a department store sale. Her boots had cartoon characters on them. She was looking around the restaurant with the kind of wide-eyed wonder that suggested she'd never been anywhere like this before. The host, a painfully thin man named Gerard who took his job far too seriously, approached them with the expression of someone who'd just discovered a problem. "Good evening," Gerard said, his tone polite but strained. "Do you have a reservation?" The woman, Callista, Vigo would learn later, shook her head. "No, I'm sorry. We were walking and my daughter was cold. I thought maybe we could just sit for a moment. We won't order anything expensive." Gerard's expression flickered. This was a man who dealt in reservations made 6 weeks in advance, in clients who didn't ask permission to sit, who simply expected chairs to appear. A woman in a worn coat asking to rest wasn't part of his script. "I'm afraid." "Let them sit." The words came out of Vigo's mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rough from disuse but clear. Loud enough to carry across the nearly empty restaurant. Gerard turned, his professional mask slipping for just a moment into surprise. "Mr. Arden? I said let them sit." Vigo gestured vaguely toward the dozens of empty tables. "It's Christmas Eve. There's plenty of room." The woman looked at him for the first time, her expression caught between gratitude and wariness. She had the careful posture of someone used to being turned away, used to taking up as little space as possible. "Thank you, but we don't want to cause any trouble." "No trouble." Vigo surprised himself by standing, his chair scraping softly against the floor. His legs felt uncertain beneath him, but he stayed upright. "Sit wherever you like." Gerard, defeated, stepped aside. The woman murmured another thank you and guided her daughter toward a table near the opposite wall, as far from Vigo as possible while still being inside the restaurant. She was trying to be invisible, trying not to be a problem. Vigo should have sat back down, should have returned to his scotch and his window and his carefully constructed ending. Instead, he watched the little girl. She'd pulled off her hood, revealing dark curls that needed brushing and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She was looking at the chandelier, a ridiculous thing, all crystal and gold leaf, with the kind of fascination that reminded Vigo there were still people in the world who found things beautiful. And then she turned, looked directly at him. Across the space of the restaurant, through the dim lighting and the manufactured ambience, a 7-year-old girl stared at a 69-year-old billionaire, and Vigo felt something crack in his chest. She said something to her mother, too quiet for Vigo to hear, and then, before her mother could stop her, she slid off her chair and walked toward him. Just walked right over, boots squeaking slightly on the marble, that red coat making her look like a cardinal in a forest of gray and beige. "Ivy," her mother hissed, standing quickly, "we talked about this." But the girl, Ivy, was already at Vigo's table. She looked up at him with that unnerving directness that children have before the world teaches them to look away. "Why are your hands shaking?" she asked. And then, quieter, with something that might have been concern. "Why do you look so sad?" The restaurant seemed to stop. Vigo stared at this child, this complete stranger, who had just asked the only questions that mattered. Not, "Who are you?" or "How much are you worth?" or any of the things adults asked when they bothered to speak to him at all. Just, "Why do you look so sad?" His throat closed. His carefully constructed walls, the ones he'd spent 3 years building, the ones that had kept him functional enough to sign documents and attend board meetings and maintain the illusion of a man still living, crumbled like ash. He started and couldn't finish. Callista was there now, her hand on Ivy's shoulder, face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry. She doesn't understand. Ivy, come on, we need to leave this man alone." "No," Vigo said, and his voice cracked on the word. He cleared his throat, tried again. "No, it's all right." He looked at Ivy, this small person in a second-hand coat who just asked the question no one else had bothered to ask in 1,000 days. "My hands shake," he said slowly, "because I'm old. And I'm sad because—" He stopped. "How did you explain grief to a child? How did you explain that you'd built an empire and lost a family and couldn't remember which had happened first?" "Because I've been alone for a long time," he finished. Ivy considered this with the seriousness children bring to important matters. Then she looked up at her mother. "He's alone on Christmas. That's not okay." Callista's face was a complicated mix of mortification and something else, something softer. "Sweetheart, I'm sure this gentleman has plans." "Do you?" Ivy asked Vigo directly. "Did he?" Vigo thought of the amber bottle in his pocket, of the empty apartment waiting for him, of the scotch he'd never actually intended to drink. "No," he admitted. "I don't have plans." "Then you should sit with us," Ivy announced, with the absolute certainty of someone who just solved a very simple problem. Vigo looked at Callista, expecting her to refuse, to take her daughter and leave, to do what any sensible person would do when confronted with a strange old man in an expensive restaurant. Instead, she sighed, smiled just a little, and said, "If you'd like. We don't have much, but no one should be alone on Christmas Eve." And Vigo Arden, who'd made 1,000 decisions that had shaped markets and moved millions, found himself unable to do anything but nod. He stood, steadier now, somehow, and followed them to their table by the far wall. Gerard materialized with menus, his expression carefully blank. Vigo sat across from Callista and beside Ivy, and realized with a strange, sharp clarity that this was the first real conversation he'd had in years. The first time someone had looked at him and seen not a billionaire, not an investor, not a name on a building. Just a sad old man who needed to be asked why. The snow continued to fall outside the windows. The music played on. And somewhere in Vigo's coat pocket, the amber bottle waited, forgotten for now, as a little girl began telling him about the Christmas lights she'd seen on their walk through the city. For the first time in 1,000 days, Vigo Arden listened. Ivy was halfway through explaining the difference between regular Christmas lights and the really good ones that change colors, when Gerard appeared with water glasses and menus bound in leather. "May I bring you something to drink?" he asked, directing the question primarily at Vigo, as though the women at the table were decorative rather than decisive. "Hot chocolate," Ivy said immediately, then looked at her mother. "Can I?" Callista hesitated, her eyes flicking to the menu Gerard had placed before her. Even without opening it, she knew what kind of prices lived inside leather bindings at a place like this. "Sweetheart, maybe just water?" "3 hot chocolates," Vigo said. He caught Callista's expression and added, more gently, "If that's all right with you." She looked like she wanted to argue. Her jaw tightened slightly, and Vigo recognized the pride of someone who'd learned to be careful about accepting things. But then Ivy made a small, hopeful sound, and Callista's resistance crumbled. "That would be, thank you." Gerard nodded and disappeared, taking the leather menus with him. A small mercy Vigo hadn't asked for but appreciated nonetheless. "So," Vigo said, turning his attention back to Ivy, "you were saying about the lights?" And just like that she was off again, hands gesturing as she described their walk through the city. How they'd started at the big tree at Founders Square, then walked down Madison where all the store windows had moving displays. Her favorite had been the bookstore with the mechanical elves building tiny books that actually opened and closed. "And there was this one house," Ivy continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, "that had so many lights I think they could probably see it from space. Mom said the electric bill must be like $1 million. Probably not quite 1 million, Callista murmured, but she was smiling, just barely, just enough. Vigo found himself smiling too. Which was your favorite? Ivy considered this with the gravity of a philosopher contemplating the nature of existence. The bookstore elves. Because they looked happy. Like they really wanted to make the books. That's a good reason to like something, Vigo said and meant it. The hot chocolates arrived in white ceramic mugs that would have been perfectly at home in a cafe that charged $4 instead of probably 20. Gerard had added whipped cream without being asked, and small chocolate shavings that looked hand-cut. Ivy's eyes went wide. "This is fancy hot chocolate," she whispered, as though speaking too loudly might make it disappear. Vigo watched her take her first sip, the whipped cream leaving a white mustache on her upper lip. She giggled, wiped it away with her sleeve, then took another sip. Pure, uncomplicated joy over something as simple as warm chocolate and cream. When was the last time he'd felt that? Joy without calculation, without wondering what it cost or what it meant or how long it would last. He couldn't remember. "What about you?" Ivy asked suddenly. "What do you like about Christmas?" The question hung in the air between them. Vigo wrapped his hands around his own mug, letting the warmth seep into his trembling fingers. What did he like about Christmas? The honest answer was, nothing. Not anymore. Christmas was just another day that Margot wasn't alive to see, another year added to the calendar without meaning. But he couldn't say that to a 7-year-old drinking fancy hot chocolate. "I used to like the quiet," he said carefully. "The way the city slows down. Everyone's busy, but it's a different kind of busy. Softer, maybe." "That's a weird answer," Ivy said matter-of-factly. "Ivy," Callista warned, but Vigo laughed, actually laughed, a short bark of sound that surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise Callista. "You're absolutely right," he told Ivy. "It is a weird answer." "Do you have a family?" Ivy asked, with the casual brutality of children who haven't learned that some questions cut. Vigo's smile faded. I did. My wife passed away. A few years ago." "Oh." Ivy's face fell. "That's really sad. I'm sorry." The sympathy was so genuine, so immediate, that Vigo had to look away. He fixed his gaze on his hot chocolate, watching the chocolate shavings slowly melt into the cream. "Thank you," he managed. Callista cleared her throat softly. "Ivy, maybe we shouldn't?" "It's all right," Vigo said, looking up. "Really?" There was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted. Then Ivy, apparently deciding the sad part of the conversation was over, launched into a description of her second-grade teacher, Mrs. Pemberton, who let them have dance parties on Fridays if everyone finished their math work. Vigo listened. Actually listened, the way he used to listen to quarterly reports, trying to find the story beneath the numbers. Except this was better than any quarterly report had ever been. This was a child's unfiltered view of the world, where the most important things were Friday dance parties and whether you got picked to feed the class hamster. He asked questions. Found himself curious. Learned that Ivy's favorite subject was art, that she'd drawn a picture of a polar bear that was currently hanging on the classroom excellent work board, that she thought cursive was pointless because everyone just types now anyway. And slowly, carefully, Callista began to speak too. She was guarded at first, answers brief and carefully neutral. But Vigo noticed things. The way she watched Ivy with fierce protectiveness. The way her coat sleeves were frayed at the cuffs. The way she didn't quite meet his eyes when she spoke, as though she was used to being dismissed. He also noticed that she had no idea who he was. She'd looked at him, truly looked, and seen only an old man alone on Christmas Eve. Not Vigo Arden, the billionaire. Not the man whose name appeared in financial journals and whose signature could move markets. Just Vigo. Just someone sad. It was intoxicating in a way wealth had never been. No one was impressed. No one was trying to angle for something. No one was afraid or careful or performing for him. Callista wasn't treating him like he held her future in his hands. Ivy wasn't afraid to call his answer weird or ask him invasive questions. This was new. This was dangerous. This was, God help him, healing. "What about you?" Vigo asked Callista during a brief pause in Ivy's monologue about hamster feeding protocols. Do you have family in the city? Something shifted in Callista's expression. Her guard went up, visible as a wall. It's just us. Ivy and me. Mom's husband died, Ivy supplied helpfully, then seemed to realize this was also a sad topic. I mean my dad. He died when I was 5. I don't remember him that much, which Mom says is okay but I think makes her sad. Ivy, Callista's voice was tight. I'm sorry, Vigo said quietly. I'm very sorry. Callista looked at him then, really looked, and something in her expression softened fractionally. Mutual recognition of grief, perhaps. The understanding that comes from having lost someone and knowing the particular weight of that loss. Christmas has been hard, she admitted. Since Elian died. Everything feels different. Vigo nodded. He understood that too. The way holidays became landmines. The way joy felt like betrayal. The way you kept moving because stopping meant drowning. It's been 3 years for me, he offered. Since my wife. It doesn't get easier, exactly. But it gets different. That's what people keep telling me, Callista said, with something that might have been dark humor. I'm still waiting for the different part to feel better than this. They shared a look, brief, but genuine. Two people who understood that grief wasn't something you fixed. It was something you carried. Ivy, sensing the conversation had veered too serious again, picked up her mug with both hands. I'm going to drink the rest really fast and see if I can get another whipped cream mustache. Ivy, you'll burn your... But Ivy was already tilting the mug back, and it happened in slow motion. The mug slipping in her small hands, hot chocolate sloshing over the rim, the ceramic hitting the table with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet restaurant. Brown liquid spread across the white tablecloth. Some of it splashed onto Vigo's coat. The mug rolled, unbroken but empty. For a second, nobody moved. Then Ivy's face crumpled. I'm sorry, she gasped, tears already forming. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, I'm so sorry. It's okay, Callista started, reaching for napkins, her own face flushed with mortification. But Vigo was faster. He reached across the table and caught Ivy's hand, small and sticky with chocolate and trembling slightly. Hey, he said gently. Hey, it's okay. It's just hot chocolate. I ruined your coat, Ivy sobbed. And the tablecloth, and I'm so stupid. You're not stupid. Vigo squeezed her hand, surprised by how naturally the gesture came. How long had it been since he'd comforted someone? Since he'd cared enough to try? Accidents happen. Look, he picked up a napkin and dabbed at his coat in an exaggerated way that made Ivy hiccup laugh through her tears. See? It's already coming out. And this coat is old anyway. It wasn't. It was Italian cashmere that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But right now, watching this little girl cry over spilled hot chocolate, Vigo couldn't have cared less. Gerard materialized with fresh napkins and a tight smile. Shall I bring another? Yes, Vigo said firmly. Another hot chocolate. And bring 2 more for us while you're at it. Ivy was still sniffling, but the tears had stopped. You're not mad. Not even a little bit. And he meant it. He wasn't performing. Wasn't being magnanimous. He genuinely didn't care about the coat or the tablecloth or anything except the fact that this child had been terrified of his reaction. When had he become someone a child feared disappointing? When had he become someone who cared? Callista was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe? Or wariness? Or something else entirely? Thank you, she said quietly. You didn't have to. I wanted to, Vigo interrupted, and realized, with a sharp clarity that felt almost painful, that it was true. He wanted to comfort Ivy. He wanted to sit at this table. He wanted to feel something other than the endless gray nothing that had been his life for 3 years. He wanted, still, to be human. The hot chocolate arrived. Ivy took hers carefully this time, holding it with both hands wrapped around the base. The conversation resumed, quieter now, softer. Ivy asked Vigo if he'd ever had a pet. Callista mentioned that they were staying with a friend across town, just temporarily, until she could save enough for their own place. And Vigo listened to all of it, The small details, the ordinary struggles, the simple fact of two people trying to make a life work against odds that seemed stacked against them. For the first time in 1,000 days, Viggo Arden realized something that should have been obvious but felt like revelation. He still cared. He could still feel. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something. The restaurant had grown quieter, if that was even possible. Outside, the snow had thickened, turning the city lights into soft halos that seemed to float in the darkness. Inside, the three of them had settled into something that almost felt like comfort, the kind that comes from shared warmth rather than shared history. Ivy was drawing on a napkin with a pen Gerard had reluctantly provided, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she sketched what appeared to be a reindeer with anatomically improbable antlers. Callista watched her daughter with the expression mothers wear when they think no one is looking, equal parts love and worry and exhaustion. Viggo watched them both and felt something shift in his chest. Not the sharp pain of grief he'd grown accustomed to, but something else. Something warmer. The realization that for the past hour he hadn't thought once about the pills in his pocket. Hadn't calculated how many it would take, or how long, or what they'd write in the obituary. He'd been too busy listening to a 7-year-old explain why penguins couldn't be Christmas animals because they live at the wrong pole. "You're good with her," Callista said quietly as Ivy started on a second napkin masterpiece. Viggo looked up, surprised. "I'm not doing anything. That's what makes you good at it. You're actually listening." Callista's smile was tired but genuine. Most adults pretend to listen to kids. You can tell the difference. "She's easy to listen to," Viggo said, which was true but also inadequate. What he meant was, she's real. She's honest. She asks questions that matter and doesn't apologize for matching. What he meant was, she makes me remember what it feels like to be needed. Callista was quiet for a moment, turning her own mug in her hands. The hot chocolate was long gone, but she held on to it like it was still providing warmth. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, measuring out words like currency she couldn't afford to waste. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why were you alone tonight? On Christmas Eve?" She looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since they'd sat down. "You seem like you should have somewhere to be. Someone waiting." Viggo felt the question land. "How did you explain that you'd built a life so big and so empty that there was no one left who knew how to reach you? That the people who might have waited had either died or given up or never existed in the first place?" "I chose to be alone," he said finally. "That's different from having no choice." Callista nodded slowly, like she understood the distinction. "I know what you mean. Sometimes alone is safer." "Safer than what?" She looked at Ivy, still drawing, oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening above her head. "Safer than hoping for something better and being disappointed again." There was a story there. Viggo could feel it, the way he used to sense opportunities in market fluctuations or investments that were about to break one way or another. But this wasn't business. This was a woman deciding whether to trust a stranger with something that hurt. He waited. "We haven't always lived like this," Callista said finally. "Ivy and me. Temporarily staying with friends, walking around the city because we can't afford to do much else." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. 3 years ago we had a house. 2 cars. Elian had a good job. I worked part-time at a company downtown. Nothing glamorous, just administrative work, but it was steady." Viggo's attention sharpened, though he kept his expression neutral. Carefully neutral. "And then everything changed," Callista continued. "The company started restructuring. That's what they called it. Restructuring. Like they were building something new instead of tearing everything down." Her hands tightened around the mug. "They laid off half the administrative staff in one day. No warning. Just an email that our positions were being consolidated for efficiency." The words hit Viggo like stones. Positions being consolidated for efficiency. He'd heard that language before. Had probably signed documents that used those exact words. Elian's company did the same thing 2 months later, Callista said. Different company, same story. More restructuring. More efficiency. He was middle management, secure, we thought. We just bought the house. Ivy was 4. She paused, swallowing hard. They let him go 3 weeks before Christmas. Vigo's hands had gone very still. He tried, Callista whispered. God, he tried so hard to find something else. But nobody was hiring, or they were only hiring people with different experience, or the salary was half what we needed to keep the house. He started working night shifts at a warehouse. Then driving for a delivery service on top of that. Anything to keep us afloat. Ivy looked up from her drawing. Mom? Are you sad? Callista's expression shifted instantly, a mother's mask of everything is fine sliding into place. No, baby. Just talking. Show me what you drew. Ivy held up the napkin. It's us. At the lights. 3 stick figures holding hands, surrounded by stars that were probably meant to be Christmas lights. Simple. Perfect. Devastating. It's beautiful, Callista said, and her voice only shook slightly. Why don't you draw one of the bookstore elves? Ivy nodded and returned to her work, satisfied. Callista waited until her daughter was absorbed again before continuing, quieter now. The accident happened on a Tuesday. February. Elian was driving home from his shift at the warehouse. He'd been up for almost 24 hours straight. Her voice was mechanical now, reciting facts that had been recited too many times. They said he fell asleep at the wheel. Hit a barrier on the highway. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. Callista, Vigo started, but he didn't know how to finish. I'm sorry was inadequate. Nothing could be adequate. The worst part is, it was preventable, she said, and now there was steel in her voice. Anger, finally breaking through the grief. If he'd still had his job, his real job, the one he was good at, he wouldn't have been working himself to death. If those companies hadn't decided that efficiency mattered more than people, my daughter would still have a father. She looked directly at Vigo then, and he saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Not accusation, she still didn't know who he was, but a desperate need to make someone understand. The company I worked for? Arden Consolidated Holdings. They owned the building management company that ran our office complex. Massive operation. Billions in assets. She said the name like it was just another fact, unaware of the bomb she just detonated. I looked them up after I was laid off. The CEO had just bought his 3rd yacht. Posted about it on social media. Can you imagine? While we were losing our house, he was posting pictures of his new toy. Vigo couldn't breathe. Arden Consolidated Holdings. His company. His name on the paperwork. His signature on the restructuring documents. He remembered it now, remembered it with sickening clarity. Winter, 3 years ago. Margot had just died. He'd been drowning in grief, barely functional, and Tovian Mail, his CFO, had brought him a stack of papers. Routine restructuring, Tovian had said. Trimming inefficiencies across the subsidiary holdings. You just need to sign. And Vigo, hollow and half-dead, had signed. Had signed and signed and signed, and then gone home to his empty mansion and stopped answering calls and let Tovian handle everything because he couldn't handle anything, couldn't think, couldn't care about quarterly reports or efficiency margins or the human cost of decisions made in boardrooms 70 stories above the people they affected. Elian worked for Tesla Industries, Callista continued, unaware of Vigo's internal collapse. Different company, but the same thing happened. Same timing. I used to wonder if there was some kind of coordinated effort, some board meeting where they all decided at once that people like us were expendable. Tesla Industries. Another one of his holdings. 70% ownership, acquired in a merger 5 years ago. Vigo's vision tunneled. The restaurant seemed to contract around him, walls pressing in. He could see Tovian's face in his mind, smooth, confident, always dressed impeccably. The numbers look excellent, Tovian had told him during their last quarterly review, the one Vigo had attended via video call because he couldn't bear to leave his house. The restructuring saved us millions. Profit margins are up across the board. Profit margins. Built on the graves of people like Elian. Built on the suffering of women like Callista. Built on a little girl growing up without a father. I'm sorry, Vigo managed to say, and the words felt like glass in his throat. I'm so sorry that happened to you. Callista shrugged, a gesture that tried to be casual but came across as defeated. It's not your fault. It's just the way things are now, I guess. Companies don't care about people anymore. They care about efficiency. Shareholders. Profit. She looked at Ivy, still drawing contentedly. I try not to be bitter. It doesn't help anything. But some days I just wonder what kind of people make those decisions. If they ever think about the faces behind the numbers. Vigo thought he might be sick. He'd made those decisions. He'd signed those papers. He hadn't thought about the faces because he'd been too lost in his own grief to see anyone else's suffering. Had convinced himself that Tovian and the board knew what they were doing, that these were just business necessities, that his only job was to survive his own pain. And while he'd been surviving, people had been dying. The company that laid me off doesn't exist anymore, Callista added, almost as an afterthought. They got bought out by someone else and reorganized again. I looked it up once. The executives who made the decisions all got golden parachutes. Millions in severance packages. Meanwhile, we lost everything. Tovian Mail had gotten a bonus that year. Vigo remembered signing that paperwork too. Performance incentive for successful cost reduction. Cost reduction. That's what they'd called it. Not destroying families or killing a man through exhaustion. Cost reduction. I should probably get Ivy home, Callista said, glancing at her phone. It's getting late and we've taken up enough of your evening. No, Vigo said too quickly. Then, softer. I mean you haven't taken up my evening. This has been, well, the most important conversation he'd had in years. The moment his entire understanding of himself shattered. Thank you for sharing your story. Callista smiled at him, genuinely smiled, and Vigo felt the weight of it like a physical thing. She had no idea. No idea that she was thanking the architect of her suffering. That the lonely old man she'd shown kindness to was the reason she'd lost her husband. Gerard brought the check. Vigo had forgotten about that, forgotten that this was still technically a business transaction, and Vigo signed it without looking at the total. His hands were shaking worse than before. They stood. Ivy carefully folded her napkin drawings and tucked them into her coat pocket. Callista helped her with her zipper, the small intimate gesture of motherhood that Vigo had witnessed but never truly seen until now. Will you be okay? Callista asked, pausing at their table. Getting home, I mean. You look. I'll be fine, Vigo lied. Thank you for this. For everything. Callista squeezed his hand briefly, the kind of touch that meant you're not alone, and then she and Ivy were gone, disappearing into the elevator bank beyond the restaurant, leaving Vigo standing by the table in a restaurant that suddenly felt vast and empty again. But he wasn't the same man who'd sat down 3 hours ago. That man had been resigned to ending things. This man had work to do. Vigo walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cold glass. Somewhere out there in the city he'd helped build, there were others like Callista. Others like Elian. People whose names he'd never know, whose faces he'd never see, whose lives had been upended by decisions made in boardrooms where they were nothing more than line items on spreadsheets. And he'd let it happen. Not through malice, but through negligence. Through grief that had made him absent. Through silence that had given men like Tovian Mail permission to be cruel. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. Probably Tovian, checking in with holiday greetings and quarterly updates. Probably expecting Vigo to respond with his usual detached approval. Vigo pulled out the phone. But he also pulled out the amber bottle. Looked at both of them in his hands. One represented the ending he'd planned. The other represented a choice. Slowly, deliberately, Vigo walked to the men's room. Locked the door behind him. And poured every pill from the amber bottle down the sink, watching them dissolve and disappear down the drain. Then he opened his phone and began scrolling through contacts he hadn't looked at in months. Board members. Legal advisors. The head of his personal investigation firm. Callista and Ivy still didn't know who he was. But they would. Eventually. And when they did, Vigo wanted to have earned the right to tell them. The snow was still falling when he left the Meridian. He didn't go home. Instead, he went to his office, dark and empty on Christmas Eve, exactly how he needed it to be. He had a lot of work to do. And for the first time in 3 years, Vigo Arden had a reason to do it. The Arden building stood like a monument to ambition, glass and steel climbing 73 stories into the winter sky. At 3 in the morning on Christmas Day, it was completely dark except for the penthouse floor, where Vigo's corner office glowed with solitary light. He'd been there for 6 hours. The desk before him was covered in reports he demanded from his archives. Personnel files, restructuring documentation, quarterly reviews spanning the last 3 years. All the paperwork he'd signed without reading, approved without questioning, authorized without caring. The numbers were damning. Arden Consolidated Holdings and its subsidiaries had cut 2,847 positions across 18 months. Efficiency optimization, the reports called it. But Vigo saw the pattern now, saw what he'd been too grief-stricken to notice before. The layoffs hadn't targeted underperforming divisions. They'd targeted middle management and administrative staff. People who'd been there for years. People with families and mortgages and lives built on the assumption that loyalty and competence mattered. People like Callista. People like Elian. Tesla Industries alone had eliminated 643 positions. Vigo found the specific report dated November, 3 years ago. He remembered Tovian presenting it during one of their video calls, Vigo barely paying attention, nodding along because engaging meant feeling and feeling meant drowning. Projected savings, $47 million annually, the report stated. Executive bonuses tied to successful implementation. $47 million. Built on 643 destroyed lives. Vigo's hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady now, holding a photograph he'd found in one of the archived files. A company newsletter from 4 years ago, back when he still occasionally attended employee events. There was Margot beside him, smiling at something outside the frame. Beautiful. Alive. Convinced that wealth carried responsibility. We're custodians, not owners, she used to say. This money, it's not really ours. It's borrowed. And someday we have to account for what we did with it. He'd forgotten that. Or maybe he'd just stopped believing it mattered when she wasn't there to remind him. Vigo picked up his phone and began making calls. His legal team first, apologetic for waking them, insistent that it couldn't wait. Then his head of HR. Then his chief auditor. And finally, reluctantly, Tovian Mail. Vigo. Tovian's voice was thick with sleep and confusion. It's 3 in the morning. Is something wrong? Board meeting, Vigo said. 9 a.m. Full attendance is mandatory. And Tovian? Bring the restructuring files from the last 3 years. All of them. The pause. Then carefully, can I ask what this is about? You'll find out tomorrow. He ended the call before Tovian could respond. The boardroom at 9 a.m. looked exactly as Vigo remembered. Long table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that looked cleaner from up here than it actually was. 12 board members sat in various states of confusion and irritation at being summoned on Christmas morning. Tovian Mail sat at Vigo's right hand, perfectly composed despite the early hour, his expression carefully neutral. Vigo stood at the head of the table and felt the weight of their attention. He'd been absent for so long that his presence now felt like an intrusion into his own company. Thank you for coming, he began. I know this is unusual. It's Christmas, Vigo, said Patricia Chin, his longest-serving board member. This better be important. It is. Vigo opened the folder before him. I've spent the night reviewing our operations over the last 3 years. Specifically, our restructuring initiatives across all subsidiary holdings. Tovian shifted slightly. We've covered this in the quarterly reviews. I didn't read them, Vigo interrupted. Not really. I signed what you put in front of me and assumed you knew what you were doing. That was my mistake. The room went quiet. The restructuring saved us significant capital, Tovian said carefully. The numbers speak for themselves. We're more profitable now than we were 3 years ago. I know. Vigo slid a document across the table. We cut 2,847 positions. Saved $180 million annually. Increased shareholder value by 37%. He paused. And destroyed nearly 3,000 families in the process. That's rather dramatic, said Marcus Webb, the board's token venture capitalist. These were business decisions. Necessary adjustments to market conditions. Tell me about the adjustments, Vigo said. Tell me about the severance packages we didn't provide. The benefits we terminated without notice. The pension contributions we restructured into non-existence. Tovian's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. All legal. All within standard industry practice. Legal doesn't mean ethical. Ethics don't pay dividends, Marcus said. Look, Vigo, we respect your grief. Don't. The word came out sharper than Vigo intended. Don't use my grief as an excuse for what happened here. He pulled out another document. Elian Thorne. Worked for Tesla Industries for 7 years. Laid off in November, 3 years ago. Position eliminated as part of efficiency optimization. No severance beyond 2 weeks. Benefits terminated immediately. He died 4 months later, working 3 jobs trying to keep his family housed. The room was silent now. Sarah Mitchell, Vigo continued. Administrative assistant at Arden Consolidated for 11 years. Laid off via email. Single mother of 2. Lost her apartment within 6 months. He looked up. Do you want me to keep going? Because I have 2,847 names here. Each one a person. A family. A life we decided didn't matter as much as our profit margins. This is emotional reasoning, Tovian said, his voice calm but firm. Business cannot be run on sentiment. We made difficult but necessary choices. You made cruel choices, Vigo corrected. And you made them while I was too broken to stop you. We did what was required to keep the company competitive, Tovian insisted. Every one of those decisions was made with the company's best interests. The company's best interests? Vigo's voice rose slightly. Or your best interests? Because I also found the bonus structure you implemented. The one that tied executive compensation to cost reduction. The one that meant every person you fired put more money in your pocket. Tovian's composure cracked, just slightly. That's standard practice. It's legalized cruelty. It's business, Marcus interjected. For God's sake, Vigo, you built this empire. You know how it works. There's always collateral loss. That's the reality of capitalism. Collateral loss, Vigo repeated quietly. He thought of Ivy's drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands. Is that what we're calling it? What would you call it? Tovian asked, and now there was an edge to his voice. What would you have us do? Operate at reduced efficiency? Accept lower profits? Drive shareholder value into the ground because we're worried about hurt feelings? I would have us act like the decisions we make affect real people. They do affect real people, Patricia said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. They affect our employees, our shareholders, They affect the people we fire, Vigo said. The people we leave behind. The families we destroy. That's who I'm talking about. Tovian stood, his chair scraping against the floor. With all due respect, Vigo, you've been absent for 3 years. You signed off on every decision we made. You gave us authority to run things while you grieved. We did what was necessary, what you authorized us to do. You're right, Vigo said, and saw surprise flicker across Tovian's face. I was absent. I did authorize this. And that's my failure. But recognizing a failure means correcting it. Vigo. I'm ordering independent audits of all layoffs over the last 3 years, Vigo continued. Every terminated employee will receive proper severance, retroactively. Benefits will be reinstated where possible, compensated where not. We're implementing new employment protections across all subsidiaries, minimum notice periods, mandatory severance packages, preservation of pension contributions. The room erupted. That will cost millions. We can't afford. The shareholders will never. I don't care. Vigo's voice cut through the noise. We can afford it. We're profitable. We've been profitable while people suffered. That ends now. Tovian's face had gone red. This is madness. You're going to destroy everything we built. No, Vigo said quietly. I'm going to fix what you broke while I wasn't paying attention. Margot wouldn't have wanted this, Tovian said, and the room went deadly silent. Your wife understood business. She understood that sometimes difficult decisions have to be made. She would have understood. Vigo stood. The movement was so sudden, so decisive, that Tovian actually stepped back. Don't, Vigo said, his voice low and dangerous, presume to tell me what my wife would have wanted. Margot believed that wealth was a responsibility. That power carried an obligation to those who had less. That every decision we made should be measured not by profit, but by impact. He met Tovian's eyes. I forgot that. I let my grief make me silent. I let my silence give you permission to be cruel. That was my failure. He turned to address the full board. But I'm not silent anymore. The restructuring is reversed. The protections are implemented. Anyone who can't work within that framework is free to resign. He looked back at Tovian. Starting with you. You're fired. Tovian's face went white. You can't. I can. I am. Clear your office by the end of the week. The board will never approve this, Tovian said, grasping for something, anything. You need a vote. I own controlling interest, Vigo said calmly. I don't need a vote. I need compliance. He gathered his papers, slid them back into their folder. Anyone else want to resign? He asked the room. Silence. Good. Then let's get to work. The Arden Foundation for Worker Protection had its headquarters in a renovated building in the district where Callista and Ivy used to walk, looking at Christmas lights they couldn't afford to compete with. The building wasn't impressive from the outside, just 5 stories of red brick and practical windows, but inside, it hummed with purpose. Vigo stood in the main office, reviewing applications for the single-parent scholarship program. 43 recipients so far, with funding for 100 more. Full tuition, living expenses, childcare support. Everything he should have thought of years ago. Mr. Arden? His assistant, Maya, appeared in the doorway. Vigo's stomach tightened. Send them in. Callista entered first, and Vigo saw the exact moment she recognized him. Her steps faltered. Her eyes went wide. Behind her, Ivy bounced in, oblivious. Vigo! Ivy rushed forward, then stopped, suddenly unsure. Is it still Vigo? Or are you someone else now? Still Vigo, he said quietly, crouching down to her level. Always Vigo to you. Callista hadn't moved from the doorway. Her face was pale, cycling through emotions too quickly to name: confusion, recognition, understanding, and then something that might have been betrayal. She started. You're Vigo Arden. The Vigo Arden. Yes. You've been all this time you were? I was, he confirmed. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I wanted to. But I needed to fix some things first. Callista's hands had curled into fists. The company that fired me. That was yours. Yes. Elian's company. Also yours. Yes. Ivy looked between them, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Mom? What's wrong? Callista's eyes were shining, but Vigo couldn't tell if it was rage or tears or both. I told you what happened to us. I told you everything. And you knew. You knew the whole time. I didn't, Vigo said. Not until you told me the company name. I hadn't been paying attention. I'd sign things without reading them, approve things without understanding them. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. Why are we here? Callista asked, her voice shaking. Why did you ask us to come? Vigo straightened and handed her a folder. This is the Elian Thorne Memorial Scholarship. Funded in perpetuity. Full coverage for single parents returning to school or training programs. The first 10 recipients were selected last month. Callista stared at the folder like it might explode. This, Vigo continued, pulling out another document, is a retroactive severance payment for your position at Arden Consolidated. 3 years of salary, plus benefits compensation, plus interest. I don't want your money, Callista whispered. I know, but it's owed to you. And to 2,846 other people who were treated as disposable. He set the papers on the desk between them. I can't bring Elian back. I can't give you the last 3 years back. But I can try to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Why? The word came out broken. Why now? Why not 3 years ago when it would have mattered? Because 3 years ago, I was too lost in my own grief to see anyone else's suffering. Vigo met her eyes. And then a little girl asked me why I looked so sad. And her mother treated me like a human being instead of a billionaire. And you told me your story without knowing you were talking to the man responsible for it. He paused. You saved my life that night, Callista. You and Ivy. I was planning to end it. And then you walked in, and you reminded me that I was still capable of caring about something other than my own pain. Ivy's small voice cut through the tension. You were going to die? Vigo looked at her. I was very sad. And I didn't think I had any reason to keep living. But you gave me one. Oh. Ivy considered this seriously. Then, I'm glad you didn't die. Me too. Callista's face crumpled. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears finally spilling over. I don't know how to feel about this. About you. You're the reason Elian died. But you're trying to... I'm trying to be accountable, Vigo said quietly. Grief doesn't excuse what I allowed to happen. But maybe, if you'll let me, I can use the rest of my life trying to fix it. The restaurant at the Meridian was fuller this time. Not packed, but alive. Couples at corner tables, a family with young children near the windows, the gentle hum of conversation and laughter. Vigo sat at a table for 4, not 2. Callista was across from him, dressed in a coat that wasn't frayed at the cuffs. She was back in school, accounting degree, halfway finished, paid for by a scholarship she'd initially refused until Vigo convinced her it wasn't charity, it was justice. Ivy sat next to her mother, 9 years old now, chattering about her art class and the painting she'd made of polar bears, the right kind of Christmas animal this time. She'd grown taller, more confident, but she still looked at Vigo with the same directness she'd had at 7. And next to Vigo sat Marcus, his grandson, Elias's son, who Vigo had finally found the courage to contact 6 months ago. 24 years old, angry and wary at first, but slowly, carefully, learning to know the grandfather who'd disappeared into grief when his father died. It wasn't easy. None of it was easy. But it was real. More hot chocolate? Gerard asked, appearing with a pot of the expensive kind. He'd warmed up considerably in the past year, ever since Vigo had funded a healthcare program for all Meridian staff. Yes, please, Ivy said. Then remembering, thank you. Vigo watched her receive her hot chocolate with careful hands, no longer afraid of spilling it, no longer afraid of disappointing anyone. He watched Callista and Marcus discuss their respective school programs. She was teaching him patience, he was teaching her to advocate for herself. He watched the snow fall outside and the lights twinkle in the city and felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. Not happiness, exactly. He'd done too much damage for uncomplicated happiness. But peace, the kind that comes from knowing you're trying to do better, even when better can never fully repair what was broken. Hey Vigo, Ivy asked suddenly. Are your hands still shaking? He looked down. Held them up. Steady. No, he said. Not anymore. Good. She grinned. Because I need you to hold the camera. Mom and I want a picture with Marcus. So Vigo stood and took the phone and framed the shot. 3 people, 3 generations of healing, smiling together in a restaurant where 1 year ago he'd sat alone planning his ending. The camera clicked. Life continued. And Vigo Arden, who'd built an empire and lost everything that mattered and then been given an impossible second chance by a child's honest question, finally understood what his wife had tried to teach him. Wealth without accountability corrodes the soul. But kindness interrupts despair. And one moment of genuine human connection can reshape not just a life, but an entire legacy. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, there was warmth. And that, Vigo thought, was enough. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.